Welcome to Scandinavian Gothic, a century of Nordic horror cinema, presented by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. This event is part of Dark Reflections, a scholarly series focusing on horror, folklore, death, and the macabre, featuring faculty and associate faculty from the College of Liberal Arts. I'm Megan Mell, Director of Alumni Experiences for the college, and I will be your host for today's presentation and the entire Dark Reflections series. Thank you all for joining us this Halloween week as we get into the spooky spirit of the season. Today's presenter is Professor Ben Bigelow. Dr. Bigelow is Associate Professor of Scandinavian Studies in the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch at the University of Minnesota, where he also serves as Director of Undergraduate Studies. He teaches a range of courses on Scandinavian cinema, literature, culture, and language. He is the author of Menacing Environments, Contemporary Nordic Eco-Horror. He is currently working on a book about the relationship between Scandinavian silent cinema and industrial energy production. During today's presentation, Professor Bigelow will explore how Nordic horror reveals the region's unique fears and cultural anxieties. Distinct from Hollywood horror, these films offer a haunting window into the Scandinavian imagination, one that may still echo in Nordic-American communities today. Professor Bigelow, thank you for joining us. I invite you to begin today's presentation.
Yes, as Megan mentioned, I'm Professor Ben Bigelow. I'm a member of the German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch department, where I primarily teach in Scandinavian studies. And I'm going to be talking today about a topic I call Scandinavian Gothic, a century of Nordic horror cinema. So the aim here is to give a little bit of a historical overview, but maybe more specifically to provide some intriguing examples that'll get you wanting to explore more on your own, and also hopefully to give everyone some food for thought about Scandinavian cultures and societies, and using those contexts as a way of understanding our own cultural contexts and our own cultural experiences. Since Gothic, and I'll go ahead and get started here. Since Gothic narratives and horror films alike frequently revolve around scenarios of menacing hospitality, we can think about the vampire who must be invited in, or the unsuspecting guest's entry into the uncanny interior of the haunted house. For instance, I'm going to start my presentation today by likewise playing host, and I'm going to invite you to experience two different films with me by way of introducing my topic, which is about Scandinavian horror cinema. And the two films I've intentionally chosen to be roughly 100 years apart in their production. So by way of centering the discussion on a pair of concrete examples, to introduce the topic, I've selected these two horror films, which were produced in the Nordic region, again, roughly 100 years apart, which can serve as a kind of handy set of historical bookends to help us draw some generalizations about the century of Nordic horror cinema this presentation's title promised to explore. So what these bookends contain within them, of course, or between them, of course, is decades of historical change within Scandinavian societies and massive aesthetic and industrial upheavals within Scandinavian film production. But as I'm going to suggest today, I believe that there are meaningful continuities that stretch across this century-long cinematic tradition that can help explain some specific conflicts and concerns that have arisen in Scandinavian cultures throughout the last 100 years. And these concerns and anxieties find expression in horror films in particularly vivid and culturally specific ways. It is a stipulation then of this talk that horror films tell us something about the social conflicts, worries, and fears that are prevalent within the culture that produces them. And because Nordic societies are more typically associated with the types of utopian narratives that circulate in international popular discourse focused on social well-being and happiness, standing as often as models of well-functioning social democracies where both people and the natural world are taken care of humanely and responsibly, I find horror serves as a sort of delightfully counterintuitive entry point to understanding Scandinavian cultures. So by looking at these two films, we learn something about these cultures and the other film examples I'm going to be giving today. we're learning something about the cultures that isn't quite captured in the fawning and utopian discourses of Scandinavian happiness, coziness, and social democratic exceptionalism. But now it's time to ground these somewhat abstract opening remarks with some concrete examples. The first case that I want to focus on by way of introduction is the Finnish silent film, so Finnish meaning from Finland, The Curses of the Witch, which was released in 1927 and is almost certainly that country's first ever feature-length horror film produced. The film begins with a memorable and luminous experience, or sequence rather, which I will try to capture for you now. A man and a woman embrace as they ride in a reindeer-drawn sled across an icy landscape, wrapped from head to toe in fur against the Arctic chill. The man is taking his young bride to their new home, a farm in the far north of Finland on the distant shores of a remote lake. The reindeer breathes hard as it cuts a confident path across the frozen lake. It is a radiant February afternoon, and the brilliant sun casts an intense light across the gleaming terrain. As the sled glides over the ice and snow, the couple discuss the lay of the land, the man reassuring his bride that their farm is located far from the beaten path. The isolation of their farmstead will keep their lives unsullied by the rowdy vagabonds and rootless lumberjacks who ply their trade in the secluded forests of Lapland, he assures her. And here we see the the suspect, suspicious vagabonds and lumberjacks who are the kind of villains of the film, or at least one of the villains of the film. Decked in snow, the landscape presents as a visually pure, unblemished country. Starting their new lives together, the couple venture into a region where the marks of habitation and histories of settlement have been covered in obscuring layers of white. With such an atmosphere of topographical blankness, one could hardly blame them for sensing that they are on the verge of settling an empty terra nova. But as they're going to find out, the land is not as isolated or as empty as it seems. As the title suggests, The Curses of the Witch, the land on which they will settle is in fact beset by the curses of an ancient witch. But if you are picturing a cackling, gnarled female witch with her black cat familiar that has dominated the cultural imagination of Europe and North America since at least the 16th century, um, you would be mistaken. In fact, the eponymous witch instead is a man, an indigenous Sami mystic and shaman who curses the land only after he has been strung up and is about to be executed by a mob of white Finnish settlers who have moved into native territory and eradicated him as the last indigenous inhabitant of the region. And they do this in order to clear space for them to cultivate the lands themselves and expand Finnish society into the Arctic frontiers of the far north. And here in this scene, which is again, reminder, this is a silent film, we see the dramatic scene of his capture by the marauding mob of Finnish settlers here. So here he is in his hut, shooting one of his attackers with a crossbow, and then he is seized and apprehended by the mob here in a fairly violent scene for the context of Finnish silent film at the time. This scene would have been rather remarkable to viewers at the time, I think. And I'll let it play out a little bit because at the end of this scene, you're going to see the actual pronouncement of the curse. And this is the curse that becomes the sort of ghost that haunts these white settlers. Whenever they feel comfortable, they are reminded of this legend, of this ancient native curse that seems to have beset the land. Here, yeah, just a little bit longer. So there is Yantuka, the Sami mystic, who is, as they say here, they describe him as a witch, and they're about to poke out his eyes. Since this is a silent film, we have intertitles which give us the dialogue. And he says, "Cursed shall you and all your offspring be, and may your family that settles here be blind from generation to generation." So that's the rather dramatic, sort of folkloresque legend that settles on the land. And anytime this young couple feels somewhat uncomfortable or unsettled as they try to establish their new lives here, they are reminded of this curse that is supposedly on the land, right? As the film shows, then the young couple is hardly entering a landscape that they can securely possess as the first settlers. The land hides uncanny histories of settler violence against native inhabitants, and the curses return to haunt their honeymoon with troubling visions and violence visited upon them by roving gangs of sadistic lumberjacks. The film serves up uncanny visions and monstrous figures who haunt the young couple and mar their attempts to secure domestic bliss together. And here is one of the more remarkable monsters that they are haunted by in vision, which is supposed to be the spirit of this witch, Yantuka, who's returning as a hairy beast, actually played by a young child actor in a hairy suit. A rather strange imagery here. And of course, it might be news to those of you who aren't fully aware of the indigenous presence in the Arctic region of Scandinavia. But the film, in that sense, actually speaks to very troubling histories of racial biology and eugenics in the region, right? In that Sami people, indigenous inhabitants of the region, were not only displaced by Nordic settlers, but were also figured by quasi pseudoscientific practices, especially in Sweden, of being an inferior race of people. So flash forward nearly 100 years later, and I'm going to invite you to experience another Nordic horror movie. In this case, it's the Icelandic folk horror film titled Lamb from 2021. The film, which in its original Icelandic is entitled Dýrið, which literally translates to the animal in the original Icelandic, is a singularly strange work of cinematic horror premised on a fanciful plot twist that has struck many reviewers as patently, if delightfully, preposterous. Lamb is so quiet and deadpan in its tone that the viewer is invited to reckon with the film's improbable scenarios as if they were plot points within a naturalist drama. Like the Curses of the Witch, which we just spoke of, Lamb follows a pair of settler farmers, a childless couple, a middle-aged husband and wife named Maria and Ingvar, who have sought refuge from the modern world in a remote and rugged terrain, generating tension and dread from the couple's fraught relationship to the land and to their dreams of attaining parenthood. Unlike its predecessor, Lamb reflects the potent environmental anxieties and ecological guilt of our present moment, showing how even the most sympathetic human characters cannot help but occupy a predatory position towards the natural world in their desperate search for domestic happiness. So, in other words, their dreams of domestic bliss are predicated upon the suffering of nature and in rather unnatural ways, as the film shows. So I'm going to let a clip play while I talk, while I continue to introduce the film. And this is the scene where the couple assumes possession of a rather strange offspring that has been born to one of the sheep on their farm. As we will find out, a kind of monstrously hybrid offspring. And I'll continue to describe it here. So, centered on a childless couple who run a sheep farm in rural Iceland, Lamb follows their unconventional entry into parenthood as they take in a strange offspring birthed by one of their ewes, a human-lamb hybrid they name Ada, and begin raising as their own. And this, as I let this clip play on, you'll see that sort of transitional threshold moment where the camera dollies in, pushes in over Maria's shoulder, and gives us a close-up, although partially obscured close-up of this lamb child that they've brought into their home. And at this point, the viewer doesn't know why they have assumed that the child belongs to them rather than to the sheep who birthed her. But as the film reveals soon enough, um, in terms of her physicality, this child Ada defies easy categorization as either human or animal. And here are some still shots of Ada as her full body is revealed late in subsequent scenes. Bipedal like a human, Ada has the head of a lamb with one anthropomorphic arm and one that ends in a lamb's hoof. Under Maria and Ingvar's tutelage for adoptive parents, Ada becomes acculturated to human habits like wearing clothing and taking her meals at the family dining table. Here we see some of those shots. Let's see. But predictably enough, all does not go smoothly with the new trans species addition to the family. Maria and Ingvar's assumption of Ada as their own, the film gradually reveals, is the couple's way of dealing with their grief at the loss of a first, presumably human, question mark, a daughter, also named Ada, who died some years before. Nor is the couple's claim on Ada uncontested. Maria is tormented by the plaintive bleats of the sheep who gave birth to Ada, as the creature habitually returns to stand outside the farmhouse and cry out for her stolen offspring. And here we see another clip, which depicts what Maria eventually does to the ewe. And this scene has a lot of implied violence, by the way, and some slightly troubling imagery, depicting how this contested maternity battle plays out in a rather violent fashion. As we see here, when she's had enough of her rival mother, Maria steals out one night and murders the ewe. And I'll just stop the scene right there. Murders the ewe with a shotgun, burying the body in a hastily dug grave near the isolated Croft house. By the end of the film, and I'll issue a spoiler alert in case you're interested in watching Lamb, and it is available to stream on many different platforms for free if you are interested. Maria and Ingvar's hard-won parental happiness is undone when Ada's biological father, a human ram hybrid creature who has been stalking the landscape and lurking unsettlingly as an off-screen presence throughout the film, reveals himself to Ingvar, the adoptive father, and the viewer, and shoots his parental rival dead. I thought I had a clip of that one, but I guess I don't. Oh, wait, maybe that's this one. So here we can I might just mute this one just so I can talk over it a little bit. I think this is the outcome of that scene. I had the slides just slightly out of order here. So this, Maria has just heard a gunshot in the distance, so she's running out to find her husband, and this is what this is the scene she stumbles upon. Her husband grabbing his neck, blood pouring out. He looks down at Ada. We still haven't seen who shot him. And then the viewer cuts to this rack focus shot that transitions between the barrel of the gun to this rather monstrous figure of the Ram Man, who we haven't seen the whole movie. So it's culminating in this revelation here of this human-animal hybrid monster. And here's the aftermath of that sequence. Let's see. Let's see. Where am I? After the Ram Man, our strange monster here, after he takes a reluctant Ada by her anthropomorphic hand and pulls her away from her father, Maria arrives and finds her husband bleeding to death on the ground. Assuming the position of her New Testament namesake in the Pietà, Maria cradles her dying husband in her lap before the screen cuts to black and the film ends. What are the through lines that can be drawn between these two Nordic horror films made nearly 100 years apart, which on their surface seem quite stylistically different and, of course, quite contextually different by virtue of being made nearly 100 years apart, and one being silent and one being sound, etc.? I would argue that despite their particularities and despite their differences, the films are quite representative of some major tendencies in the region's horror production, expressing cultural anxieties that prevail in Scandinavia in rather specific ways. First of all, both films center on anxieties related to settlement, focusing on the fears of settler farmers who are confronted with the fact that their claim upon the land is not as secure as it seems. As the earlier film more pointedly relates this settlement anxiety to violence against indigenous inhabitants of the land whose habitation has a deeper and longer history, we could also analogize this Nordic concern with settlement to the trope of the so-called Indian burial ground in American horror novels and films of the 1970s and 80s, most notably the Amityville Horror from 1979 and The Shining, here depicted in Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of it from 1980. Just as this trope has been critiqued as a problematic relic of Native American claims on the land being relegated to a historical past, the films like The Curses of the Witch also suggest that settlers are never the first to arrive on the land, no matter how much they would like to think so. A second through line that we can find in these two films that is characteristic of Nordic horror cinema more broadly is that its horrors tend to focus on rural or wilderness landscapes, trafficking in specific worries about humankind's ability to tame the natural environment. And while scholars have argued that American backwoods horror expressed a puritanical fear of the wilderness that was particular to American culture and its puritanical colonial settlers, and as with that fear of the natural world in the American colonial context and its association with satanic force or satanic evil, um, it suggests that the landscape that the colonial settlement of the country has been thought of as an unholy domain, unsanctified by the church, and therefore the default domain of evil. However, in Scandinavian cultures, this assumption is quite the opposite. Scandinavian cultures, on the other hand, have traditionally seen the wilderness in much more humanistic terms and more optimistic terms. Indeed, because the Nordic region has been associated with progressive environmental politics and energy projects that are promoted under the guise of sustainable development, there has been a dominant narrative both within and without the region that Scandinavians have an exceptionally close and humane relationship to the natural world. Films like the two that I have just described challenge this notion of Scandinavian environmental exceptionalism, suggesting that nature is not as amenable to human settlement as Nordic environmental optimism would suggest. In recent years, this environmental strain in Nordic horror cinema has expressed an increasingly acute sense of environmental guilt and climate anxiety as well, suggesting that the horrors that confront the characters in these films within the wilderness are ultimately the side effects of Nordic privilege and excessive consumption. One final consistent through line between these two films that is characteristic of Nordic horror generally is its engagement in social issues and problems through the cinematic techniques of social realism. One explanation for this particular quality of realism, and socially engaged realism at that, in Scandinavian horror cinema is that the genre, which emerged in silent cinema production of the early 1920s, is an outgrowth of a broader social realist tendency in Scandinavian culture since the so-called modern breakthrough of the 1870s and 1880s, when playwrights like Henrik Ibsen and August Strindberg, novelists like Amalia Skram and Victoria Benedictsson, along with many other authors and artists across the region, consciously developed an ethics of political engagement within their artistic expression. Art, for them, could not be said to be of any value if it didn't, in the words of the Danish literary critic Georg Brandes, set problems up for debate. So a painting like the one we see on this slide is setting up the debate of child labor and child poverty by showing this sort of scrum of impoverished children in this urban setting, this early modern urban setting, scrambling for a donation of bread, a pittance that's thrown out from a bakery, and they're scrabbling for it. So it's drawing public's attention to the problem of poverty, especially childhood poverty. In response to this social realist impulse, leading Scandinavian authors and artists turned away from national romantic traditions and started writing contemporary narratives set in relatable middle-class milieus, exploring matters of social and political debate within the region, including sexual liberation and sex work, women's rights, and poverty and child labor. Nordic cinema has generally followed suit and has been traditionally associated with an aesthetics of serious-minded and socially engaged realism, and the horror genre is no exception to this tendency. And you might be saying, wait a second, we just saw a film with a ram man and a sheep human hybrid. How is this realism, right? But I want to say, I'll just to explain, even when the situations seem outlandish or even fantastical, Nordic horror films aim to unsettle the viewer in order to draw their attention to social problems and dilemmas, including problems related to stewardship of the environment and a kind of toxic relationship to nature that has taken hold in this sort of modern industrialized capitalistic economy that is geared toward excessive consumption. Taken together, these various tendencies within Nordic horror cinema can be said to add up to a genre that has been exceptionally adept at questioning the dominant utopian narrative of Scandinavian exceptionalism. But you might ask yourselves, you might be asking yourself this question right now, what is the value of taking such a culturally specific approach to horror cinema in the first place? Why not study the genre through its most globally well-known examples? One response that I would give to that is that Scandinavian cultures occupy a particularly important position in the popular imagination in Twin Cities specifically, and also the Upper Midwest more broadly, because of the exceptionally high numbers of people in this area who can claim Scandinavian cultural heritage after the influx of Scandinavian migrants seeking largely agrarian and urban labor work here in the 19th century and afterwards. My own interest in Scandinavian horror in particular, I'm not from Minnesota or the Midwest. I don't really have any Scandinavian heritage to speak of my own. But my own interest in Scandinavian horror in particular began when I decided to design an undergraduate course in Scandinavian horror, aimed that was aimed to both attract students within our Scandinavian language programs. We teach Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish here in our department. Those are the Nordic languages we teach. And we have students who are very interested in those languages and want to learn about the cultures those languages emerge out of. So I was designing this class for those students, but it was also aimed at attracting students from outside the department, from across the College of Liberal Arts, who are interested in just learning more about other topics and have the requirement of a liberal arts requirement, liberal education requirement, and are required to take courses outside of their field. And the student response to the course was immediate and enthusiastic when I first offered it in 2019. When I surveyed my students on why they enrolled, which is something I always do at the beginning of every semester, I was struck by how many of them said they joined the class because they loved horror films and they saw the word horror in the course description, and many of them and they relished this thought of earning a college credit by watching horror films and studying them through perhaps a more rigorously academic lens than they might have previously. Many others, on the other hand, said that they actually disliked horror and actually expressed nervousness about some of the films that were going to be assigned, but they were going to brave it through what they regarded as somewhat anxiety-inducing films they'd have to watch because they were interested in Scandinavian culture by virtue of having a grandparent or a great-grandparent or a great-great-grandparent who had emigrated from Finland or Norway or Sweden and wanted to learn something more about their own heritage, essentially. This enthusiasm that I got from students really sparked my interest and changed my research agenda somewhat. So much so that I temporarily shelved a book project I was working on a totally different topic, and instead, in 2019, began researching and writing about on the role of natural environment in Scandinavian horror films, which was eventually published as a book in 2023. Another response to this question of why Scandinavian horror is worthy of study is that it has been something of a blind spot in academic studies of horror more generally. Histories or guidebooks of horror cinema rarely feature films produced in Nordic countries to any significant extent. The main impression one gets from reading these kinds of works is that the genre has largely been an American cultural product, or at least an Anglophone cultural product, British American or largely Anglophone product, starting with a few well-known silent monster movies that were sensationalist adaptations of classic novels, then progressing to the golden age of horror production with the classic monster movies produced by Universal Studios in the early 1930s, which was the early sound era. Um, and then after World War II, these histories generally suggest there were mostly horror films were mostly B pictures, a lot of creature features, which gave way to a period coinciding with relaxing legal codes of film censorship and the rise of the new American cinema in the 60s and 70s. And when this happened, art horror films by artistically ambitious auteurs pushed the bounds of what was acceptable to show on screen. For example, in Rosemary's Baby from 1968 or The Exorcist from 1973. At the same time, independent film producers eager to make a quick buck by trafficking in sex and violence made low-budget exploitation films, solidifying modern horror as a low-brow genre, a culturally disrespected and denigrated genre outside the bounds of the cultural mainstream. This changed somewhat when horror went more mainstream during the slasher boom of the late 1970s and 80s, which was kicked off by John Carpenter's staggeringly successful independent horror film Halloween from 1978, which spawned horror franchises that dominated cineplexes and living rooms in the VHS era throughout the 1980s, including Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Child's Play, to just name a few. And then, by the way, I'm recounting this broad historiography of horror film in a way that's fairly simplified, as a way of just capturing what these conventional histories of film horror tend to do, which I would suggest is rather reductive and somewhat simplistic. But just so it's said, I'm recounting the somewhat simplified version. After this slasher boom petered out in the second half of the 1980s due to the oversaturation of the marketplace, the slasher reemerged in a more knowing and self-referential second wave of slasher films in the 1990s, a trend that was kicked off by Scream, and which itself soon dissipated as pale imitations of Wes Craven's blockbuster neo-slasher became less and less popular with audiences. When these histories turn their attention to recent trends in horror, they emphasize how a more socially conscious and more aesthetically ambitious form of so-called elevated horror has emerged, and this genre designator, elevated horror, has received quite legitimate criticism because of its vagueness on the one hand, and also its clear hint of cultural elitism on the other hand. In any case, this new wave has had the effect of placing horror again at the center of film culture, but now as a genre that is claiming a newfound cultural respectability and social relevance. This trend includes the so-called social horror films of Black auteurs like Jordan Peele and Ryan Coogler in the 2010s and 2020s, as well as the folk horror films by young horror virtuosos like Jennifer Kent, Ari Aster, and Robert Eggers. Where is the place of Scandinavian horror in these narratives as of horror as a primarily American and Anglophone cultural product? There is a strain of international examples that run through these histories. When these international horror traditions are mentioned at all, they are invoked as intriguing one-off case studies that are included only to sow some interesting cultural diversity and variation into a broader narrative of American dominance. Notable international horror traditions often included in these works include the German expressionist silent cinema of the Weimar era, exemplified here by two famous examples: Nosferatu by Murnau from 1922, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1921. These expressionist films provided a visual language of tortured angles, labyrinthine set designs, and expressively dramatic shadows, which had a lasting influence. And these aesthetic techniques, these aesthetic signatures, were later adopted in the classical noir cinema of 1940s Hollywood and reappeared in a kitschier, somewhat postmodern form in mainstream American cinema through the influence of Tim Burton starting in the 1980s. Or these histories might mention the post-war Japanese kaiju monster movies like Godzilla, which served as a potent mode of exploring traumas of war and modern life in the nuclear age. Outside of these post-World War II tendencies, these histories often mention the wave of influential Japanese and South Korean horror films in the 1990s and 2000s as notable regional variations on the American horror form, reflecting the particular social conditions and cultural anxieties of East Asian cultures. When Scandinavia does appear at all in these mainstream histories of horror cinema, it is in the form of intriguing but isolated single examples. There are legitimate reasons for downplaying horror as a major genre in Scandinavian film productions. Even Scandinavian film critics are somewhat skeptical about the role of horror in Nordic cinema history. The Norwegian film historian Gunnar Iversen, for instance, writes, quote, "There is no long and coherent horror tradition in the cinemas of the Nordic countries, and no large or consistent corpus of horror film production." And this lack he rightfully attributes to the biases of government film funding models toward more culturally respectable and mainstream genres. And this government funding model, by the way, is really important in the Scandinavian film culture and in a lot of like smaller market film cultures in general. Because in order to produce films within these smaller countries that are actually produced within the country domestically, it is not a profitable venture, generally speaking, and so it requires some government support, some state support. And so these state support policies, the fact that they were sort of slanted against horror, meant that it was very hard to produce a horror film, a sort of straight horror film, until the 1990s, when these funding models were liberalized and made way for private capital to start funding films. And this set of reforms led to what many commentators have described as a wave of so-called new Nordic horror, starting in the 1990s and especially kicking off in the early 2000s. Um, because this horror has now belatedly become an undeniably major genre in Nordic film production, what I want to explore with the remainder of my time today is what happens when we decenter American cinema in discussions of horror and instead examine international horror cinemas not as intriguing comparative cases, but as legitimate and culturally specific traditions in this own right, in their own right, rather. To this end, I want to focus the remainder of my presentation as a kind of highlight reel of Nordic horror cinema, which I will anchor in a series of major trends within horror production as a way of kind of giving us a little simple rubric to follow. So these major trends and subgenres we could identify would be, on the one hand, settlement horror, which we discussed in the introduction to my talk earlier today. Secondly, a major trend is witchcraft and the so-called tortured woman trope. A third trend, or what we could even call a kind of subgenre of Nordic horror, can be described as welfare state Gothic, and I'll explain what that means in a little while. And then finally, we will treat the last two bullet points sort of in tandem through one example, which are the categories of eco-horror or environmentally oriented horror, one could say, and folk horror, horror that is inspired by folklore or ideas of the pre-modern sort of folk traditions. Since we've already explored the sort of the first bullet point, as I mentioned, I'll kind of limit my remarks to the last four bullet points, the last four representative trends and subgenres within Scandinavian horror film. We're going to start then with witchcraft. If I had to single out one dominant narrative figure in the history of Scandinavian cinema, it might be the witch. The history of witchcraft and witch prosecution has been a notable fascination, and some might even say fixation, of the most respected and culturally canonized filmmakers working in Scandinavia since the silent era. And here I'm referring to people like Carl Theodor Dreyer, the Danish auteur, Ingmar Bergman, the Swedish auteur, or Lars von Trier, the younger generation of Danish auteur who came of age in the 80s and 90s, all of whom focus largely or have films that prominently feature women who are accused of heresy, who are shown being tortured and signing coerced confessions and then burning at the stake or otherwise being executed by state or religious authorities. When witchcraft is invoked or explored in these films, it is usually through the exploration of the way torture is visited upon the accused woman's body in ways that seem to verge on the sadistic. This is so much the case that film scholars have identified the prevalence of the witchcraft motif in Scandinavian cinema as a kind of paradox. Linda Haverty Rugg, a Scandinavian film scholar, even goes so far as to pointedly label this impulse as a, quote, tradition of torturing women in Scandinavian filmmaking. As she writes here, when teaching courses in Scandinavian art cinema, it is difficult to avoid the anxious question of why the most prominent Scandinavian directors of the 20th and 21st century seem so caught up in the representation of female suffering and sacrifice. Given the deserved Scandinavian reputation for a progressive measure of gender equality, it is more than striking that the trope of the sacrificial woman links the work of the most prominent Scandinavian film directors as a kind of authorial inheritance. So the question or the paradox here is, why is this such a fascinating and even sort of gleeful fixation of a lot of Scandinavian filmmakers if it seems like a regressive and even misogynistic sort of trope? One answer can be provided or one can be suggested by looking at one of the earliest examples of film horror in Scandinavian cinema, which is Benjamin Christensen's 1921 silent film Häxan, which literally means the witch in Swedish. Häxan is both one of the first feature-length horror films produced in Scandinavia and is also considered by many to be one of the foundational masterpieces of the genre produced anywhere in the world. As just one marker of the film's international reputation among modern horror filmmakers, Guillermo del Toro, the celebrated Mexican horror auteur, included Häxan in a list of top 10 films written for the Criterion Collection, and he described the film as a, quote, strangely titillating record of sin and perversity that is as full of dread as it is of desire and atheistic conviction. Guillermo del Toro's use of the word titillating here is quite apt, since Häxan might also be seen as one of the most transgressive horror films of its era. Directed by the Danish filmmaker Benjamin Christensen, Häxan is an unusual genre mashup. On the one hand, the film is a documentary-style narrative tracing the cultural history of witchcraft, informed by Christensen's reading of the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a treatise published in 1520 as a kind of handbook for witch inquisitors, how to detect and stamp out the evil of witchcraft in their community. On the one hand, the film is also comprised, on the other hand, then, the film is, besides this sort of documentary aesthetic where he's showing us about the cultural history of witchcraft, the film is also comprised of dramatic sequences that stage in lurid detail the kinds of outlandish perversions and sins witches were accused of when they stood trial. These dramatic sequences, which were shot in a massive set built on a soundstage in Copenhagen and were so expensive that they made the film the highest budgeted Scandinavian film ever produced at the time, focused on the sexual perversity and monstrous strangeness contained in the witchcraft accusations, including some explicit imagery and nudity, which led film censorship boards in many countries, including the United States, to ban the film outright. These sequences read like Boschian fever dreams to the viewer, depicting in gleefully graphic detail the kinds of strange and bestial acts of perversion that were said to take place at a witch's Sabbath. And the director, Benjamin Christensen himself, I'm going to mute this as we let it play. The director himself dons makeup and prosthetics to play the devil. And we see here one of these scenes where a witch's Sabbath is depicted in this somewhat over-the-top sensationalistic mode. And Christensen chooses this sensationalistic mode as a way of suggesting the sort of ridiculousness of these witchcraft accusations at the center of the witch trials. And here I'm just kind of scrolling through. Here we see some of the perversity as the witches are invited to kiss the behind of this satanic figure. Okay, so however, but underneath this spectacle-driven, rather hallucinatory sequences the film is most remembered for, it is ultimately a humanist work of cinematic art whose main goal is to humanize the marginalized women who were executed for witchcraft in the 16th and 17th centuries. Christensen seems particularly intent on reviving the material culture of the witch inquisition for his viewers, using actual artifacts from local museums in order to show how devastatingly visceral the experience of torture was felt by the accused. In the final sequence of the film, which I'll let play on mute here in the background, Christensen ends by laying out his main thesis, which is essentially that modern Scandinavian societies haven't progressed as much as one would expect from the days of witch burning. Instead of calling the marginalized woman a witch, modern society might label her a hysteric, or might send her to a clinic to receive an admittedly less brutal form of physical treatment, but nevertheless a coercive and patriarchal practice that Christensen places within a clear historical continuum with the pre-modern tradition of witch burning. And here in this final scene, just to sort of fast forward through it a little bit, he's showing how modern witches operate as sort of fortune tellers or people who are a little bit on the margins of society. Not as directly figured as witches. And here he shows one woman who's been diagnosed with hysteria being treated at a clinic with cold showers, and he sort of analogizes that to the brutal treatments they would have experienced previously, showing how this is a coercive and predatory regime in his view. And this final shot, as you can see, cuts to a dramatic reenactment of witch burning, right? And that's what the film ends with. This dissolve edit suggesting that there's a clear continuity between modern misogyny and pre-modern misogyny. It's not so much a difference of kind, it's only a difference of degree, in other words. Fast forward to the 21st century, and a leading member of the new generation of Scandinavian auteurs, the Norwegian filmmaker Joachim Trier, makes a film called Thelma from 2017, which he says is inspired by the tradition of the witch film that has been so prevalent in Scandinavian cinema. His aim clearly is to make the genre an even more progressive and feminist form of horror, fit for the gender politics of Scandinavia in the new century. Just very briefly, the film centers on a young woman who goes to college for the first time, and at that point leaves her parents' home. The woman has been raised in a rather conservative Christian household where she has had no independence from her very controlling parents, especially her controlling father. Although when she moves to this big city in Oslo, this very secular city, she attempts to keep her devotional attachment to Christian belief in check through rigorous rituals of prayer and parental check-ins. She gradually becomes engrossed in an intense physical attraction to a female classmate, Anya, a form of queer desire that is explicitly forbidden by her particularly fundamentalist form of Christian faith. Though she attempts to contain her lust, Thelma's internal conflict ultimately explodes into involuntary fits that resemble epileptic seizures. And even more unsettlingly, her desire begins to escape her body as what is gradually revealed to be a kind of psychokinetic power where she can move objects or control the will of others around her, bringing them to her or sending them away. Without going into too much detail in the plot, it is striking that the film resolves its central conflict between the repressive paternalism of Thelma's father and the now liberated feminine unruliness of its protagonist in a scene where the father is sacrificed instead of the witch. And I'll put this on mute. This is where her father meets his demise. It is suggested that he meets his demise as a kind of psychic execution by Thelma, whose internal powers, and it's cross-cutting between Thelma and her father here, whose internal powers lead to this rather dramatic outcome as he sits on the lake in his canoe fishing and smoking a cigarette. As we will see, he hears some unsettling noises in the sky, some birds that seem to be circling him, and something seems to be awry in nature. And then he will look down at his hand here in a moment. He sees who he thinks is his daughter on the shores of the lake that he's on, but then he doesn't see her. And then I think it's coming. He looks down at his hands, which break out in fire. So his body begins to immolate, and the immolation drives him to jump into the lake. Every time he gets out of the lake, he catches fire again. And so he meets essentially what is a kind of parody or a kind of parody or overdetermined version of the witch execution. He dies both by water and by fire in this case. But the point is the same no matter what, as her father is executed. That marks the ascendance of this now liberated female figure. Just as the tradition of witchcraft horror has moved toward a more progressive exploration of the uncanny persistence of misogyny in Scandinavia, other forms of horror in the region have similarly found pointed ways to critique the shortcomings of the lauded social democratic Nordic social model. This is a tendency I'm labeling here welfare state Gothic for the ways that it shows how, even within the supposedly empathetic and egalitarian institutions of Nordic social democracy, its societies are still haunted by the misdeeds of the past, and the most vulnerable elements of the community, especially children, are those who bear the brunt of these shortcomings. Nowhere is this more evident than in the groundbreaking Swedish vampire film Let the Right One In, which is set in a planned suburban housing development outside of Stockholm, Sweden, in the early 1980s. The film follows a lonely and awkward child protagonist named Oskar, who is mercilessly bullied by his classmates. Marginalized within his peer group, Oskar gets no relief from his teachers, who are willfully ignorant of the bullying, or his divorced parents, who are too caught up in their own relationship to spend any significant time after school with their son. Into this fraught situation arrives a strange young girl named Ellie, who moves into the neighborhood apartment with an older man who would seem to be her father. As we quickly realize, though, Ellie is not a normal girl at all. She's a vampire who has lived for hundreds of years, and the man she lives with is just the latest in a long string of human familiars who serve as her henchmen. Like the most famous figure of children's literature in Scandinavia, Pippi Longstocking, Ellie is a powerful and autonomous child who upends the child grown-up hierarchy. Unlike Pippi, though, Ellie survives on blood, enacting a series of brutal and bestial kills of local inhabitants to maintain her fragile state of undeath. Ellie also becomes Oscar's mentor, urging him to stand up to his bullies and promising to be there for him if she ever needs to be. Oscar understandably develops a fondness and a crush for Ellie, which is only strengthened by the end of the film when she saves him from a particularly heinous act of bullying. Oscar is suffering at the hands of older boys who seem intent on killing him in the locale of a local public pool. They're about to drown him, in essence. And I'll just include images of what happens, which is that Ellie comes and attacks and overcomes his attackers rather severely and brutally, meting out vengeance on these boys who are attacking her friend. And here's the sort of bloody aftermath as we have severed limbs and severed heads, and these bullies reduced to a kind of a bloody pulp. And Oscar being able to escape his tormentors and into the hands of his now dearest friend, the vampire Ellie. Right? Before concluding today, and I have maybe about 5 more minutes or something, so I'm going to go just a little bit over. I want to touch on the last two trends in Nordic horror cinema identified earlier in this presentation, eco horror and folk horror, by looking at a single example, which is the celebrated Swedish-American co-production Midsommar by the American director Ari Aster. I'm going to skip some of the material in the interest of time, which sort of defines what I see as eco-horror. If you are interested in a more technical exploration of eco-horror, we can discuss it in Q&A. But suffice it to say, it's a form of horror that uses this sort of unsettling relationship between humans and the environment as a source of anxiety or dread, depicting oftentimes how the human is figured as a kind of monstrous a parasite on the environment or a monstrous force that's curtailing or otherwise damaging the environment. There are many examples of eco horror that could be mentioned, including the campy Icelandic maritime slasher film called the Reykjavik Whale Watching Massacre. And just to thumbnail that strange film, this is a film in which eco tourists who have traveled to Iceland for a whale watching tour become prey to a gang of sadistic, disenfranchised whalers who have been deprived of their jobs of hunting whales because of environmental activists who have challenged the legality of whaling. And this band of sadistic whalers therefore turn their anger against the tourists who have, in their view, infected Icelandic society with an excessive environmental concern. There are many others I could mention, but I think for our purposes today, Midsommar can serve as a kind of case study here. Midsommar conjoins these environmental concerns with a subgenre of horror film that's become kind of popular again, which is the folk horror film. And there are many examples I could point to of Scandinavian folk horror more specifically, but folk horror is a now global genre of horror film since the 20 teens. This is a film, as I mentioned, directed by an American director, Ari Aster. It's set at the height of the summer solstice in northern Sweden, where the sun never sets this time of year. The film follows a group of American tourists, several of whom are graduate students in anthropology, who have visited an isolated agrarian cult in order to study their strange customs in what turns out to be an unsettlingly physical proximity to the cult. The film follows a young woman named Danny, who accompanies her boyfriend Christian on the trip as a distraction following the recent traumatic loss of her family. The film, which the director himself rather aptly and playfully labeled a kind of Wizard of Oz for perverts, as we see here in the slide, explores the strange rituals of the fictional cult at the center of the film, referencing in intentionally scrambled ways the folk traditions of pre-modern Scandinavia, pre-Christian Scandinavia, which include disturbing and graphic scenes of ritual suicide and a series of increasingly unsettling communal meals where the tourists are given hallucinogenic drugs and drawn into strange and coercive rituals they do not understand. The Americans, of course, are killed one by members of the cult. Their bodies are used at the end of the film for the culminating ritual of sacrifice in the worship of the pagan nature deities the cult worships. And Danny herself, however, wins the ritual dancing competition at the end of the film and is crowned May Queen, becoming an adoptive member of the community. In the process, she is enlisted to authorize the sacrifice of her deadbeat boyfriend. We have been led to not be very sympathetic of Christian. He's shown to be quite a deadbeat who doesn't really care about her at all. He's looking for his chance to dump her as soon as he can. I'm going to play some of this final scene on mute here in the background while I wrap up my remarks. And that yellow structure there is the sacrificial temple where Christian and the other bodies of the American tourists and others who have volunteered to sacrifice are burning. And it cuts between the image of the burning temple and Danny here, who is rather dragged down by this entire sort of costume of flowers that she's been decked in after being crowned the May Queen. The film rather playfully or sort of cuts between this sort of this sort of pseudo folkloresque, not really authentic form of Swedish folk culture depicted here, and the sort of the communal suffering they experience as they watch this act of sacrifice. And it dissolves between that burning temple and Danny herself here, and a rather enigmatic smile that creeps across her face at the end as she relishes this idea that her old life is entirely gone. Her ties to her old community are entirely gone. And now she gets drawn up into this rather troublingly close-knit cult, right? It is a kind of eco-fascist sort of community here. Though time prevents me from giving you further examples and delving into the specific interesting byways I hoped to go down, I hope that my remarks today have provided an intriguing sampling of the kinds of horror narratives that persist in a way that some who are more attuned to the utopian narratives of Nordic cultural exceptionalism might find surprising. One conclusion that can be drawn from the discussion today is that when compared to other international horror traditions, Nordic horror is exceptionally attuned to unsettling the comfortable relationship humans in the region have traditionally felt for the natural environment, using vernacular folklore and folk traditions of the region, as well as invoking socially aware critiques of the shortcomings of the welfare state. As the horror scholar Carol Clover has argued in her very influential book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, horror can only work if it has bodily effects, if it gets us in the gut, if it elicits a felt experience of anxiety and fear in its viewers, a physical reaction, triggering a fight or flight response, making our hair stand on end, that kind of thing. Hopefully, my presentation has also contained something of an appeal to the mind as well, giving you something to think about today. Thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to fielding any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Professor Bigelow, for this really fascinating talk and deep dive into Scandinavian horror films and subgenres. And I was not expecting that reference to Pippi Longstocking in this presentation, so thank you for that. We are now going to move to the Q&A portion of our event. So just a reminder to our audience to submit questions or comments through the Q&A button. I know I certainly have a few questions, as to our audience, so we'll try to get through as many questions as we have time for. We did have a couple that came through the registration, so while everyone's putting their questions into the Q&A button, I'll go ahead and start there. One of our audience members asked, are there recurring mythological or folkloric figures that persist in Nordic horror today?
Yeah, one could say one could identify a kind of wave of troll centered horror films that have been kind of characteristic. The troll being, of course, like a modern variation of like the mythological giants or Jotnar of Nordic mythology. And being this kind of pre-modern folkloric figure. The troll is an interesting figure. There was the first a film called Troll Hunter in 2010 in Norway, and then several remakes and reiterations of that. Recently, there's been a Netflix film just called Troll, I believe, which is rather spectacularly oriented against humans. It's kind of like a Jurassic Park like like scenario where you have these figures who are supposed to be, you know, contained within the earth, and they wake up and they sort of visit violence upon humans. They emerge from the mountains and they visit violence upon humans, and they are, we have these humans coming together to try to subdue them. But also, there's this environmental critique of like, why are they emerging? Oh, it must be some environmental sin that we're inflicting on nature, and that's why nature is disordered, right? So yeah, I would mention the troll as one mythological or folkloric monster or figure that is quite common, but others have been included as well, including various folklore figures. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Another question we received, how do these films engage with silence, minimalism, and pacing, features often associated with Scandinavian art more broadly? And how does Nordic folk music factor in some of these films?
Okay. Yeah, I'm also distracted by the Q&A that, or some of the questions that I'm now seeing on some of these. Oh, sorry. Okay. So yeah, silence and deliberate pacing, right?
Yeah,
And
silence, minimalism, and pacing. I'll put that in the
yeah,
chat.
yeah. Silence, minimalism, pacing, and also I think there was a question about folk music. Yeah, and I think I think part of what is interesting about how, as I mentioned, Nordic horror, like straight up genre horror, was not really produced in the Nordic region until the 1990s, until the liberalization of funding models made it a more commercially, privately funded and commercially oriented kind of filmmaking. And so from the very early days of this modern horror wave, a lot of all the films were consistently sort of adopting, and then we could say like Nordifying or Scandinavian, like engaging this process of Nordification of American horror conventions, like taking the slasher film and turning it into a more Nordic variation, which is more socially critical. And in this process, and this is maybe characteristic of like this sort of so-called elevated horror genre that's been quite, prevalent elsewhere as well. Um, uh, because the traditions in Scandinavian film production had always sort of privileged like art film, which tends to be slower, more self-reflexive, more cerebral, sometimes more surreal or dreamlike, not intended to give very clear answers. Because that had been the sort of dominant tradition in Scandinavian filmmaking from the beginning, this art film aesthetic of slowness and deliberate pacing and minimalism. Once horror becomes a really viable genre in the 90s, you get a kind of hybrid form, right? Which some scholars have pointed to as a kind of middle, like middle concept, middle brow sort of hybridization of like genre filmmaking of horror and art filmmaking of the Scandinavian auteurs like Ingmar Bergman. And so you do get this very deliberate pacing, this very sort of this tendency toward minimalism. A lot of international reactions like that you see on like fan sites to some of these Scandinavian horror films will be like, this wasn't scary at all. Why was it so slow? And there's something to the ponderousness of the pacing in a lot of these films. It gives you a lot of time for thought, a lot of time to consider, and so I would say this sort of more artistic, thoughtful, more slowly paced form of horror has been characteristic from the very beginning. And some of those earliest films, I talked about Hexon, and it's sort of surreal, strange sequences. That's actually quite an outlier in Scandinavian film as being sort of transgressive and spectacle oriented. It's much more characteristic that you'll have slow, deliberate, kind of vaguely menacing horror narratives rather than directly assaultive horror narratives, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. We had two questions come in about finished movies. So the first one is wondering if you've seen the finished film Rare Exports, and which they describe as a dark, scary, action-packed film about the true origins of Santa Claus.
Yes, I
If
have.
you could pronounce that in Finnish, the name of Santa Claus, that
I
is.
don't speak Finnish, but joulupuki I would be my best would be my best attempt. I try my best, but I don't actually speak Finnish. I speak Norwegian, so
Have
yes.
you seen this film, and do you have any thoughts or reactions to it?
Yeah, I would place it within this kind of, again, this kind of, and I didn't, if we went back to my slides and I showed like just a few examples of the sort of new wave of Nordic horror films, I could have put Rare Exports in there as well as a kind of earlier variation. It came through this sort of modified funding model as well, and it's characteristic again of that sort of Nordification process, right? Where it's like it's not or filmmakers aren't content to just purely ape American or international horror tropes. They have to domesticate them in some way, in a way of like usually with by mixing them with folklore. And the figure of Santa Claus is a really interesting one because it's almost like undoing the Americanization of the Santa Claus figure, right? Because in the Scandinavian countries, the name for a Santa Claus or a Santa Claus-like figure is usually taken from folklore, like with this pre-modern Christmas folklore. So in Norwegian, it's julenissen, which is like a Christmas gnome, but the nisse is like the nissa is like A Nissen is like a sort of like little trickster, a sort of invisible trickster elf or gnome that sort of lives on a farm, and that you have to appease with porridge in order for your animals and your farm not to be messed with by this little trickster figure. So you have to feed him porridge, and you have to put butter on your porridge, or else you get sort of tormented. But then once we get this Americanized form of Christmas in Scandinavia in like the mid-century, when you get, American culture after World War II sort of seeping in everywhere, you get this American cultural imperialism everywhere. We get this sort of modern Coca-Cola version of Santa Claus being mixed with these native Scandinavian folkloric figures, and so you have the Julenisse now, and so sometimes it becomes, and so a film like Rare Exports serves to almost like de-Americanize and by showing the true Nordic origins of that figure. So I think it's a really interesting example just because it does show those dynamics of what do these smaller culturally sort of marginal film traditions in countries where you don't have many people, you only have a few million people speaking the language, or in Iceland you have only 400,000 people or 500,000 people in the entire world that speak Icelandic, and many times in its history sheep have outnumbered Iceland, the population of humans in Iceland, right? So you have these very small places to make films, and when you take in these tropes and these conventions from international genres, there's always this impulse to say, how can we make this our own? How can we domesticate it? How can we make it amenable to a domestic audience and appealing to them? And so the folkloric becomes this way of doing it.
We have a couple questions about specific films or film series. One is, where would you say the Wicker Man films fall, both the original with Woodward, and our guest feels that's the better of the two, and the remake with Nicolas Cage? Where would those fall?
Or would they fall? Oh, yeah, that's like a prototypical folk horror film, and Midsommar is kind of an homage to that. There are like a lot of individual shots that could have been that are kind of, yeah, pastiches of Wicker Man. What's interesting about folk horror in the Scandinavian context, and related to this concept of or related to the aesthetics of the Wicker Man, it's just this narrative of basically a secular outsider coming into this closed community that has this sort of perverse, skewed cultural beliefs. In this case, it's like a police officer who's come to investigate a missing child, a report of a missing child, to this island in the far north of the UK. And there's this closed community, and they, worship these like fertility symbols and are very attuned to things like phallic symbols and things that have to do with, yeah, fertility and bounty in nature. And so as the film goes on, you gradually realize they're not threatened by the police officer. He's been drawn here as a kind of trap, so he can be the sacrifice that's burned at the end. So you can see the way in which Midsommar is kind of an homage to that film. Folk horror is usually described as a way of, or as an expression of like modern urban dwellers' fear of the rural, right? Fear of people who live in rural landscapes, right? Fear of people who haven't come into this modern industrialized urbanized society, and like fear that they might represent some older, like supposedly bygone social order that threatens to like overtake you, right? So in that sense, the dynamic is very much the same with Midsommar and other examples of folk horror in Scandinavia. And I think it's really, but as I mentioned kind of in passing, what I think is really interesting in the distinction between like American folk horror and Scandinavian folk horror is that, as I mentioned, there is a kind of ingrained American fear of the wilderness. It comes from this Puritan, at least the settler version of American culture, which comes from the puritanical settlers and their associations with wilderness as evil. However, in Scandinavian tradition, Scandinavian pre-modern traditions, you had their figures of nature were creatures like the trolls, like I mentioned earlier, and in Scandinavian fairy tales, that were collected in the 19th century and sort of express this or our kind of records of this pre-modern folk cultural belief, the troll is very imposing, but also very dim-witted and easily subdued if you are only resourceful enough and clever enough to subdue or trick the troll. The troll is always tricked, by this young small boy, usually in these fairy tales. And so the idea here, or that is a kind of a perfect encapsulation of this Scandinavian environmental optimism, which is a kind of environmental an assumption about nature, which is that nature is there. It can be imposing, but ultimately it can be subdued. It's not something we should fear as evil. In fact, we need to go out into nature in order to conquer it, in order to get resources for ourselves. So there is this discourse of nature optimism, one could say, that is very characteristic of Scandinavian society, and that's why if you're familiar with Scandinavian cultures, a lot of them are very oriented to the outdoors and have a kind of quasi-religious relationship to nature, right? A lot of modern Scandinavians will say, I don't go to church, I go to the forest, or I go to the lake, or I go to the sauna, or I go to, somewhere out here outside of society, and I have these rituals that gets me in touch with nature. And so the interesting thing about folk horror in a Scandinavian context, to sort of complete this thought, is that the rural is and the wilderness is traditionally not something to be feared. So it's like associated with Scandinavian cultural identity in general. It's not an other. It's actually the rural is part of the cultural mainstream in a way. And so when you set these narratives out in the wilderness and you show these beliefs systems as kind of skewed or perverse or bad or threatening or violent or fascistic in the case of Midsommar and other films like it, then the implication is that it's holding a mirror up to Scandinavian society and saying, your environmental beliefs that are supposedly very based in this kind of nature worship and are very, humane and very organic. There's something sort of perverse or rotten at their core, or at least they could lead to this kind of eco-fascistic like elimination of the human or of the weaker humans. And so I think there's this kind of there's this kind of mirroring effect, the social mirroring effect of saying this is us, this is the ugliness that lies underneath the veneer of nature loving benign Scandinavian cultures. So.
Great, thank you. And then if people were interested in learning more about eco horror, you have a book specifically dedicated to this?
Yes, yes. I mentioned it in the chat. Yeah, or I could put it in the chat. Yeah, I mentioned it in my presentation, and it is available as an open source, book. You can just search it and download it for free as a PDF. It's called Menacing Environments, and it's by me. It's by University of Washington Press, from 2023. So yeah, just Google that. You can find a PDF for free if you're interested in more. It's also lots of bibliographical sources if you're interested in exploring more about eco horror or any of the other little side notes that I just kind of came in by, just by implication there.
Great. Thank you. I wanted to get that little plug in there again. Okay, a couple more questions from our audience. We have some people asking about specific films that you may or may not be familiar with, but one of our audience members says, not Nordic, but there are parallels with these thematic elements and the work of Stephen Graham Jones, or rather, are there parallels with the work of Stephen Graham Jones, for example,
Yeah.
the massacres in The Buffalo Hunter?
Yeah. Um, Yes, absolutely. I haven't read all of his books. I've read a few though, and these he's a Native American author, and he's I believe one of his films has been adapted, or one of his books has been adapted to a film, at least. In any case, he's a fairly successful genre filmmaker, excuse me, genre author who centers narratives on these sort of complex modern Native American protagonists, and sometimes puts them in these sort of situations that come straight out of a horror film. There's one book called My Heart is a Chainsaw, which is basically like a young Native American girl placed in this slasher scenario in this sort like that resembles a Friday the 13th movie. Um, and yeah, I would say that you get a little bit of that, but if I had time to like suggest one thing I'm interested in seeing where Nordic horror goes from here is with all the consolidation of the various production companies and the fact that we get like a lot of film production nowadays is supported by these global streamers like Netflix or HBO Max. And so you get interesting cultural representation on those channels, but sometimes it gets very watered down for an international audience. And one thing I'm concerned about, or one thing I hope to see more of, is horror films that are produced by indigenous people in the Nordic region themselves, right? Indigenous Sami people, because you get Sami figures in a lot of horror movies, but they're very problematic depictions. They're very stereotypical. They're often victims. They're placed in the past. They have all the same like settler colonial limitations as a lot of American horror traditions do with the trope of the native burial ground that I mentioned earlier. So I don't know. That kind of went off in a weird direction based on the question, but yes, I have admired the work of Stephen Graham Jones and interested in the ways it's in dialogue with some of these Nordic indigenous figures. Yeah.
Ah, great. That was a great question. I should note the full title is The Buffalo Hunter Hunter. So
Okay.
I always get it
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That makes more sense.
We have time for maybe two more questions. We have a question here asking about Nordic vampires. So you mentioned Let the Right One In, which is a vampire classic, and
Yeah.
audience member feels that there are cool vampire stories coming from Scandinavia, but they're often not really popular. Uh,
Right.
any comments on Nordic vampires?
I've seen these examples referenced. I have to admit I haven't explored them in depth on my own. The Vidar the Vampire or I think that's supposed to be Postmortem, right? I think that was on Netflix. In any case, any comments on Nordic vampires? I think what's really interesting to me is that I don't have it again. The vampire narratives haven't been a major genre of like new Nordic horror. There have been it's been like the earliest wave was mostly slasher oriented or sometimes zombie or other monster oriented, and then we had a wave of like these Nordic folklore monster figures from like yeah various like forest creatures from Nordic mythology and stuff like that. So the vampire hasn't been a huge subgenre within Scandinavia, so I have to admit it hasn't been a major focus of mine. But I think because the vampire narratives in general have a really interesting, like they have a really interesting tendency to kind of blur the boundaries between a cultural insider, a cultural outsider. The vampire, like in the Dracula story, is like this suspect cultural outsider who comes from the East and is infecting the West by moving to the UK, the center of modern civilization. And they become these kinds of infection narratives. They become these outbreak narratives, right? It's like a disease that's breaking out through the blood, and so you have to eradicate this outsider. And so they can have the tendency to become very xenophobic narratives, right? A fear of this outsider and the desire to literally stake the outsider to the ground, right? Bind their corpse to the earth. Um, and um, and at least in the examples of Nordic vampire narratives that I've seen, it's been this more recuperated vampire figure that's more characteristic of modern vampire stories in other contexts, whereas people like very often like Ellie that are not so they are predatory, but they're not as they are also sympathetic. So it's kind of the humanizing the monster is a tendency that I would identify, and you do another associated subgenre of horror that I would say is pretty interesting in a Scandinavian context is the outbreak horror narratives that I mentioned. Sometimes these are zombie outbreaks, or sometimes they are like virus outbreaks where people turn into monsters of various kinds through this kind of viral infection. And because they touch on the the sort of very real political questions of how to police borders and like how to put up boundaries around the nation, they become a really interesting mode for exploring like anti-immigration politics and sort of these sort of very strident populist outbreaks of political discourse that have been a major part of Scandinavian parliamentary democracy since 2015 in a way that was totally unprecedented before that. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, we're just about to the end of our time here. Somebody else had posted in the Q&A asking if there is a list of films that were covered in the presentation, but also ones that were part of your research. And I think we can certainly work on putting that together and sending that out.
Yeah, and I have a filmography in my book. So I think Brian Vertruba, our intrepid departmental librarian, put a link to my book in the chat if anybody wants to check that out. And look to the bibliography. I believe there's a separate filmography that at least shows every film I mentioned in the book. So that might be a good starting place.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll be sure to link to that in our follow-up email. So we're at the end of our event. We've made it through most of our audience questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question or comment. A special thank you to our presenter, Professor Ben Bigelow, for walking us through a century plus of Nordic horror. It was fascinating and exciting. So thank you again. Our final event in the Dark Reflections series will be Hitchcock and Horror, Secrets, Shadows, and the Art of Suspense tomorrow on Halloween at 11 a.m. Central Time. You can find more information about this and other presentations by visiting our website at z.umn.edu/darkreflections. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I'm wishing you all a thrilling Halloween.